Cue the synthesizers and the neon lights as we fasten our seatbelts and journey back into the early 2000s, a time when flip phones were all the rage. Low-rise jeans reigned supreme, and the echoes of the 1980s lingered in the air. This episode takes us to Miami. So I'm going to do my best Sophia Petrillo from Golden Girls. Picture it. Chalk Airways Flight 101, where the promises of adventure soared higher than the skyscrapers of Miami Vice's iconic skyline, and Golden Girls' Miami Nice skyline. Get ready for a narrative that blends the essence of the 2000s with the mysterious crash that shook the aviation world. So grab your parachute of curiosity, because this flight is about to take a nosedive into the enigmatic skies of Chalk Airways. Fasten your seatbelts, fellow time travelers, as we embark on a journey through the clouds and the secrets that linger within. This is Destination-Aviation. Well, welcome everyone, listeners, back to the podcast. I am your host, Jeff. We had our episode a week ago that we adjusted things a little bit. I had some comments in about liking the intro leading up, but they liked some of the other stuff about it. So we added the intro back. One of our listeners, awesome, amazing listener, mentioned that they like the lead in because it gives them the opportunity to realize that story time is ahead. Thank you for submitting that comment. I always love to hear the constructive, positive feedback that people have about the show. So thanks for letting us know about that. In the news, we talk often about politics. We are still in limbo when it comes to FAA reauthorization. We are staring down the barrel again as we reach towards the end of December. Mike Johnson, known now for his pornography with his son. I guess they have an app that they share together to check each other's pornography intake. Interesting thought there, I guess. I don't know. But beyond that, it sounds like Senator Duckworth, Senator Sienna, and Chuck Schumer, the families of the Kogan air crash, everybody's still combating about the 1,500-hour rule in pilot training, but maybe there's something on the horizon that the Senate's bill could get out for a vote. Not holding my breath. We'll see what ends up happening there, but lots of fun stuff happening. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. I was just talking with the East Hampton airport officials today out in East Hampton on Long Island. So I asked them if they were in George Santos's district, which they weren't, but they're adjacent to. So it was interesting to get a little tidbit. I did not even anticipate that as I was getting onto that meeting today. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. They're from where George Santos paid for his OnlyFans with his campaign contributions. How ridiculous was that, by the way, huh? I mean, you would expect some people to hide it maybe a little bit better. He literally just took money out of his campaign funds to pay for an OnlyFans. And then also people would contribute money to him, like $2,500, and he would charge them $5,000. And they would get hit by the IRS because it's above individual contributions to one or to one individual who's running for office. So a personal contribution. I mean, there was like no even avenue out for him. So we got to see him scurry away in his car, which was always interesting, but enjoyable, I guess, nonetheless. One of 6 House of Representatives ever expelled from Congress. So amazing stuff there for sure. In other news, we do have a YouTuber who is going to jail. He, if you remember, I think it was a year or two ago, he crashed his single-engine airplane into the California National Forest, admitting that he downed the aircraft to boost views on his YouTuber. I think if anybody's on YouTube, which we are, but let's not just say us on this. And we're cool with me, right? Everybody's cool here. Okay, well, even if you're not, let's just say there's a YouTuber I think all of us know that we would be okay with them going to jail. This Trevor Jacob, 29, made an admission in a plea agreement filed in federal court in Los Angeles. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of destruction and concealment with the intent to obstruct a federal investigation, a crime that carries a maximum penalty of 20 years behind bars. Jacob posted the video behind the charge. I crashed my airplane on December 23rd, 2021. As of Thursday, the 13-minute clip had nearly 2.9 million views. The video shows Jacob described in the plea agreement as an experienced pilot and skydiver. He took off from Lompoc City Airport in a Taylor Craft BL-65. This was nearly a month before he published the video online. Roughly 1 minute into the video, Jacob flies over Los Pedros National Forest. A camera mounted on the aircraft shows the propeller appear to stop working, and the cameras capture Jacob jumping out of the plane as it crashes into the mountains. Unfortunately, Jacob intentionally did this to get views. That's kind of the world we live in right now, right? Everybody wants views to stop the engine of the aircraft. I don't understand it. I fully intend at some point, talking with some people in my life, that we're maybe going to start filming some of the flights that we do and putting it on YouTube. But you can sure as heck bet that I will never shut my engine off purposely and crash an airplane for views. That is just ridiculous. So he is going to spend 6 months in jail, which is well short of the 20 years that he potentially could have gotten. He probably will get his notoriety, though, that he was anticipating anyways. I don't know if the FAA is going to give him his pilot license back, but I guess we'll find out. So, unfortunate set of circumstances in the age we live in right now. I don't know if you also saw, I remember this from my time in California. Hawaiian Airlines and Alaska Airlines are two of kind of the mainstays of the West Coast for the United States. I remember I was actually talking with one of our sergeants who worked for the San Jose Police Department, and he was trying to go to Hawaii with his wife, and he looked at Hawaiian Airlines, and I had asked him, well, did you look at Alaska Airlines? And his response back to me, no, I'm not going to Alaska, I'm going to Hawaii. And I said, yeah, I know that's the name on the side of the plane, but they fly other places besides just Alaska. I don't think that registered either, but Alaska and Hawaiian do have a lot of parallels. Obviously, the 49th and the 50th states, both are state-run airport systems. Both Alaska and Hawaii are heavily dependent on air travel to connect the islands, to connect the vastness of Alaska. So it's interesting to see this merger. I was really interested to see what name they will take, right? They have the Eskimo on the tail of Alaska Airlines, and then they have, the Hawaiian female on the back of the Hawaiian aircraft. And there's just such an identifiable element to the livery of those aircraft, to their cultures. So it will be interesting to see how they integrate between both cultures and where we end up with this. But I think it was $1.9 billion they spent, and Alaska Airlines is acquiring Hawaiian, and it will be based out of Seattle. It will be very interesting to see how it continues to shape, mold, and fold. I do have both of them as airplane models. Any good person in aviation, right, has a ton of airplane models. So if someone can just look into your office and be like, oh, this person must work in aviation. Because look, they have plane models. That's the whole idea behind plane models. That and the sniffing glue. I kid, nobody's sniffing glue. But so interesting news on that front. And then something a little more closer to home for me here, the Chicago O'Hare Airport. United and American have announced that they are not backing the plans for the O'Hare modernization due to the fact that it's currently $1.5 billion, yes, that is billion dollars, over budget. I can't even imagine being into a project that's $1.5 billion over budget. As in usual course, there's been some talk that United may pull out their headquarters. So typically what happens in these high-stake negotiations that have been ongoing for months. So I don't know. O'Hare definitely needs some modernization, though. The last time I was in there, there were FID screens missing, so the flight information display screens. A guy came out in a wheelchair and vomited. Now, I'm not saying a new terminal would help that necessarily, but it just, if the terminal was nicer, it may make the vomit seem more, something you could deal with when you get on your flight. But they updated the airfield recently. As we know, the O'Hare modernization took that into consideration. They were going to create this kind of global hub for both American and United, but all of that is now currently in jeopardy because of the ballooning budget for this terminal. I will say with O'Hare, it's a residual cost structure, which basically gives the airlines a majority in interest so they can approve all these kind of capital developments and improvements. And of course, with both airlines having such a huge presence in the Chicago market, they can kind of push their weight around. But in their defense, $1.5 billion is a heck of an amount of money to swallow to just be over budget. So it'll be curious to see how that continues to unfold with both of those groups. Well, I guess all three of those groups, including the city. So as many of you know, if you listen to the podcast, I was feeling under the weather for quite a while there. I did get sick, got the flu or some variation of the flu. And so been trying to just maintain my own health and get these kind of podcasts still up on a regular interval and rolling. So we changed it up last week, still changing it up a little bit, adjusting from some of the comments that we were able to get in. But really, for me, it was kind of trying to figure out what the next episode was going to be for the podcast. I'm very much a child of the 80s and 90s. So things like Miami Vice, Golden Girls, you heard us talk about it up front. Those are a couple of the staple shows. For me, I actually lived on a boat for a while, and I had this thought in my head, like, I'm Don Johnson. But in reality, I was Jeff, who fell on the back of his boat in the San Francisco Bay with a box of Jack in the Box, which spilled my fries all over into the bay. So not probably as elegant as a Don Johnson vibe. But as the other night, I was actually, we were watching some music videos. Yes, amazing music videos. One of them happened to be Careless Whisper. And so as we were listening to Careless Whisper from George Michael, the actual music video shows Chalk Airlines and the individual in Miami getting on a Chalk Airways, which is an amphibious aircraft. And it just clicked with me because I remember the story. Watching One Miami Vice, the aircraft was featured in that show. I don't think it was ever featured in the Golden Girls. And if you don't know from the reference at the beginning, back in the day, Miami Vice and the Golden Girls were out around the same period, both set in Miami. And so they would call it Miami Vice, and they would call the Golden Girls Miami Nice. So that was the reference at the beginning. I wish I was smart enough to take credit for coming up with it, but I am not. So as we started talking about it last night, we were saying, hey, this could be a good idea for a podcast. So let's talk a little bit about what Chalk Airways was. They are no longer an airline, but who they were and what this accident was and the kind of significance behind it, and maybe just some of the things that have popped up in pulp culture about Chalk Airways. So I think one of the things to do up front here is just talk a little bit about the history of Chalk Airways. The airline was founded by Arthur Burns, Pappy Chalk. It started as an ad hoc charter operations as the Red Arrow Flying Service in 1917, flying a float plane. 1917, that is crazy. After Pappy Chalk served in the Army Air Service in World War I, he returned to Miami and commenced scheduled service between Miami, Bimini, and the Bahamas in February of 1919 as Chalk's Flying Service. Chalk's first base was a beach umbrella on the Miami shore of Biscayne Bay. In 1926, a landfill island, Watson Island, was created in Biscayne Bay close to Miami. Chalk's built an air terminal there and operated it from the island for the next 75 years. Now, this next part is a little bit of a window into maybe some of the issues that came down the road for Chalk Flying Service. During Prohibition, Chalk's was a major source of alcohol smuggling from the Bahamas to the United States. Pappy Chalk, as it was, sold the airline to a friend in 1966, but continued to be involved in the daily operations of the airline until he retired in 1975. He died in 1977 at the age of 88. In the early 1970s, Frakes Aviation bought the rights to the aircraft and began a conversion program, replacing the old Pratt & Whitney R1340 Wasp radial engines with the Pratt & Whitney Canadian PT6 turboprops. By 1985, 3 of Chalk's 8 Grumman Mallards had been converted, with 5 ex-military piston-engine Grumman Albatrosses, aircraft making up the balance of the fleet. Mallards are interesting. I have some behind me in the river. They like to come up, especially this time of year in the winter, and eat some birdseed. They are nature's friends. Sometimes I feel like down the river, they're laughing at me when I go out because they go, And it sounds like, hey, wait a minute, I'm just trying to feed you guys. Why are you laughing at me? But yes, so these amphibious aircraft, back to our story and away from the ducks that are laughing at me, were updated in 1985. That is the year Miami Vice made its debut, and the Chalk aircraft, which is in question that we're talking about with the accident, was actually featured in the very first episode of Miami Vice. In 1974, Resorts International purchased Chalk Airlines, which became the primary carrier to Paradise Island near the Bahama capital of Nassau, where Resorts International owned and operated hotels and other resort facilities. After Resorts International constructed a short takeoff and landing runway on Paradise Island, it switched to using the de Havilland Canada DHC-7 turboprop aircraft operated by subsidiary Paradise Island Airlines. It sold Chalks in 1991 to United Capital Corporation, which is an Illinois-based investment firm not affiliated with United Airlines. United Capital expanded Chalk's service to Key West, Florida, and Nassau and acquired additional aircraft, but struggled financially. In 1996, United Capital sold Chalk to a group of investors who operated the airline under the name Pan Am Airbridge. In January of 1998, Texas-based aircraft lease company Air Alaska purchased 70% of Pan Am Airbridge, but following the collapse of Air Alaska, Pan Am Airbridge filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection only a year later, on January 11, 1999. James Califalone, a businessman and former Eastern Airlines pilot, purchased Chalks out of bankruptcy for $925,000 on August 2, 1999. At that point, the airline was reduced down to 2 aircraft and 35 employees. James Confalo bought 5 additional Grumman Mallard seaplanes and arranged a contract to buy 14 larger Grumman G111 seaplanes to expand the operation. On December 17, 1999, the airline relaunched as Chalk's Ocean Airways. In late 2001, following the September 11th attacks, Chalk's was forced to leave its longtime operations base on Watson Island due to security concerns over its proximity to the port of Miami. Helicopter traffic had also increased around Watson Island. Operations moved to Fort Lauderdale International Airport, where Chalk's already had a maintenance base. Now, there's a little bit more of the history here, but I think it would make more sense if we get into the accident itself and then circle back to some of the history on the company. As we talked about, we're now into the late 2000s. We went through various owners. We went through bankruptcy and, of course, 9/11, which changed everything in aviation. So you have a struggling airline, a new owner, you're moving your base of operations. Now we're getting to 2005 and the accident. So let's get into a little bit here of that. The gentle hum of the turboprops echoed through the Florida air on that fateful December day in 2005 as Chalk's Ocean Airways Flight 101 prepared for its journey from Fort Lauderdale to Bimini, a routine passage over the azure waters. Little did the 18 passengers and true crew members aboard know their destinies were entwined with a 58-year-old relic, the Grumman GT-73T turbine Mallard, the last airborne echo of an era gone by. That day, the Grumman G-73T turbine Mallard was captained by Michelle Marks, 37, who had just recently become captain with Chalk Airlines. First Officer Paul D. Sanctus, 34, of Wyoming, Pennsylvania, had joined the airline 8 months before the accident. Marks had 2,820 hours of flight under her belt, and DeSantis had accumulated 1,420 flight hours. The flight was routine that day. They did stop to pick up VIPs. Sergio Dalaguncourt and his girlfriend. Sergio was the grandson of the Bacardi family fortune, so the Bacardi rum family fortune. Most passengers that flew on Chalk's Airlines did it out of necessity and the fact that it was so convenient to the islands and where they were going. One of the main reasons, or I should say, the main ticket driving sales for this airline as well was the departures in both an amphibious, boat and / airplane. So the fact that you're actually taking off on water. So after loading the plane, it was a fairly normal takeoff in Government Channelway, which connects the Port of Miami with the Atlantic Ocean. One of the standard procedures for takeoff in one of these Grummans is that both the pilot and the first officer have their hands jointly on the throttle during takeoff. This is in case there's any inadvertent waves that cause the pilot to pull back on the throttle. This didn't happen. The aircraft took off fine and is now cruising past the very popular South Miami Beach, which is packed with tourists. The aircraft's climbing through 500 feet when suddenly the plane rolls violently and dives. Tourists capture what appears to be the right wing of the aircraft ripping off of the plane as it plummets towards the Atlantic Ocean. At roughly around 2:38 p.m. in the afternoon, Chalk's Airways hits the Atlantic Ocean. The onlookers are stunned at what they see. Local lifeguards are the first to respond. They take their jet skis and equipment and they head out towards the crash site. The crash site itself was eerily calm. They knew right away from some of the bodies that they had seen that there was going to be only recovery, no rescue mission. Up to this point, Chalk's Airlines had pretty much an impeccable safety record. So the NTSB mobilized a unit, sent it down to Miami Beach to start to investigate what happened here. Of course, rumors started to swirl. We talked about Sergio, who's the Picardi grandson, so heir to the fortune. He had boarded this aircraft to go purchase a luxury yacht. However, the rumors that swirl basically are around the fact that his grandfather had a lot of issues with Fidel Castro back in the day while he was building his empire. So actually, the FBI was even brought in to investigate some of this wreckage because it did appear at some points that maybe there was an explosion that completely separated the right wing. After further investigation, though, by the FBI and the NTSB, it was ruled out that there was any foul play because of Sergio being on the aircraft. So then the attention focused away to, pilot error. They do have the video. They had the video from the tourists that showed that this wing ripped off, which pretty much immediately ruled out pilot error and the fact that it looked like there was a structural issue that happened, which then refocused the NTSB onto structural issues that were going on potentially with this aircraft. So part of this investigation went into things like the age of the fleet. The accident aircraft had been built in 1947, and the manufacturer Grumman, now referred to as Northrop Grumman, and side note, I actually had a chance to go tour the Northrop Grumman plant. It was pretty awesome. They do set up tours for the public, so if you get a chance, I definitely would recommend trying to go to one of those locations. They had produced only 60 of these aircraft types. Grumman ceased operations of the aircraft in 1951. So think about this. This is 2005. This aircraft has not been manufactured since 1951. This left operators with no source of new spare parts. Chalk's Ocean Airways had to resort to purchasing several unairworthy mallards to cannibalize for spare parts. In addition, the sort of aircraft used for Chalk's operations, a passenger-carrying flying boat of this type, was no longer manufactured by aircraft companies, so the option of replacing any of the aging Mallard fleet with newer designs were not available to them. At the time of the accident, this particular aircraft was 58 years old. It had accumulated more than 31,000 total flight hours and had completed over 40,000 takeoff and landing cycles. When the aircraft was certified in 1944, the Mallard design was required to satisfy a static strength analysis. However, no fatigue requirement was yet in force, and no satisfactory fatigue analysis method had been developed at that time. The Mallard, therefore, had not been designed with a safety life figure. Unlike most civil transport aircraft today, which have designed fatigue lives of around 65,000 to 70,000 hours, or 20 years. In addition, no authorized repair manual for this aircraft type had been issued by the manufacturer, responsibility for authorizing repair techniques and having been acquired outside of the company after Grumman discontinued support for this type of aircraft. The accident aircraft had been acquired by Chalk's in 1980 and upgraded to the G73T Turbo Mallard in 1981 when its original Pratt & Whitney Wasp H piston engines were replaced with a Pratt & Whitney Canadian PT6 turboprop. So this whole stress test thing, right? It's basically we've all probably bent a paper clip at some point in our life, right? It's the same as like wing design and for metal fatigue on an aircraft. The more you lift, just by the principles of flight, right? You come down, you put weight onto it. Eventually, all those components start to have metal fatigue. So at this point, we've flown 40,000 hours, but there's no standard for this aircraft on when it's no longer airworthy. The NTSB investigators also referenced some pilots' concerns. As a result of a number of incidents involving chalk aircraft, concern had risen among chalk pilots about the state of repairs of their aircraft. Pilots had experienced a number of engine failures, and in one incident, an elevator control cable snapped in flight. Although fortunately the pilot were able to land the aircraft safely, this led to the Chalk's pilots reconsidering their position in the company, and one, having suffered 2 engine failures during his period there, resigned his position over what he perceived as a persistent maintenance issue in the fleet. So you have pilots that are concerned, you have an older aircraft that has no testing really requirements set forth by the manufacturer, and you have issues with shoddy maintenance that has been happening since this company's really been acquired and sold. We talked a little bit about that history up front, which is why we did, about going through different owners through the 80s and 90s and ultimately through bankruptcy, now being revived. So it looks like corners maybe potentially are starting to be cut, and this is when this accident happens. So the NTSB determined the probable cause of the accident was fatigue failure in the right wing, initiated by a crack in the span-wise stringer close to the wing root. The crack had been detected running through a slosh hole, an aperture in the wall of the stringer that allows fuel to flow from one side of the stringer to another, and seemingly repaired earlier, but the repair was eventually proved ineffective. So as a matter of fact, when they went to fix this, they actually put an epoxy over this crack, which unfortunately concealed the crack from future maintenance inspections. The Mallard was designed in the 1940s with a so-called wet wing, where the fuel tanks, instead of being separate items within the wing, are constructed from sealed-off portions of the wing structure itself. This eliminates additional weight of the tanks and also allows more fuel to be contained within the given wing size. The drawback of this form of construction is that all of the joints around the tank seams must be sealed in order to ensure that the tank is fuel-tight. In addition, the normal flexing of the wing in flight has a tendency to open seams over extended periods of time. This leads to fuel leaks. And in this case, there had been multiple fuel leaks reported by the mechanics. They looked over this aircraft multiple times, noting often that there was a fuel leak coming from the right side of the aircraft. Grumman had also issued warnings as early as 1963 about fuel leaks from the Mallard's wings being indicative of possible structural problems. However, the mechanics didn't know this or didn't fixate on it, and they just continued to fix the wing without looking at if there was a root problem. So as we talked about, the accident aircraft over a period of several months suffered from repeated fuel leaks, but have been remedied by the operator by repeatedly applying the sealant inside the seams of the fuel tanks. In applying the sealant inside the right wing, the operator inadvertently applied the material over the damaged lower stringer, an important load-bearing structure member of the wing. It was in such a way that we talked about concealed the crack. The crack was discovered during previous maintenance, and an attempt was made to repair the crack by grinding it out. In applying the sealant, the operator was required to access inside of the fuel tank small removable inspection hatches in the top of the surface wing. This resulted in poor visibility and awkward conditions for working inside the tank. The sealant concealed the previous repair to the stringer and made subsequent checking for further damage to this component impossible. The first outward sign of possible significant problems with the accident aircraft was when a crack was discovered running from the front of the wing towards the rear. The crack was noticed in the skin of the lower surface of the right wing at the root. After several failed attempts of stopping the crack by drilling stop holes, we've seen this all the time. I see it when I do my pre-flight check on different Cessna 172s that I'm renting. There's a lot of these drilling stop holes all over the aircraft. It just is kind of the nature of flying older planes. But this was done repeatedly on this crack. And it was also tried to be fixed by applying fixing doublers, metal patches intended to take over the load from the damaged part. So we saw this with some of the other stuff we talked about in previous episodes of this, where they're basically putting a patch, like if you were to patch your jeans, a hole in your jeans, you put a patch over it, it takes some of the stress off of the actual damaged part. Normal repair procedure for minor skin damage. Subsequently, this patch was riveted to the aircraft. However, the crack continued to grow, requiring longer and longer doublers to be fitted. Although the skin crack was slowly getting longer, it was not thought to be anything other than a skin problem, which could be dealt with by affixing a doubler. However, if we remember, Grumman cautioned that if you had a crack plus a fuel leak, this was indicative of a structural problem. Unfortunately, the maintenance technicians did not note this as a potential structural issue. Like most aircraft of this period, the Mallard was built using aluminum stressed skin construction. Unlike earlier fabric-covered aircraft, where the fabric covering is merely for aerodynamic purposes and contributes little to overall strength of the airframe, the metal skin itself carries part of the flight loads and is stressed during flight. Many such aircraft develop minor skin cracks over time, provide appropriate action is taken to repair these cracks. Safety of the aircraft is not compromised. So if you're taking into effect that you're going to repair the aircraft efficiently, this is not a problem. The unseen cracked stringer on the accidental aircraft allowed for the right wing to flex more during flight, which increased the bending forces at the root, such that the visible skin crack slowly increased in length with each subsequent flight. And then remember, we have 40,000 flight hours on this plane. The crack in the underside of the wing grew. It grew in length until the wing was so weakened it was unable to support the flight loads during the accident flight, and the wings separated. This caused the fuel contained within the wing to be released and ignited, resulting in the fire seen by witnesses. By sheer chance, what we talked about earlier, the tourist from New York was capturing Flight 101's final moments as it crashed into the ocean. This video did, though, extremely help investigators to confirm what eyewitnesses had said about this accident, that the wing had actually separated. On examination of the wreckage, investigators discovered that in addition to the external doublers, internal doublers had also been affixed to the root area of both wings. However, maintenance records for these repairs were not available. Investigators also concluded that the cracked stinger initiated the wing loss and probably failed completely some considerable amount of time prior to the accident, leading to substantial weakening of the wing structure. So basically, where this stringer was supposed to be taking most of the support of the aircraft, takeoff and landings, it had basically corroded away, disconnected, and now the wing had full weight and takeoff dynamics every time it left the ground or landed. And so this ultimately completely weakened the entire structure of the right wing. On May 30th of 2007, it was reported that the National Transportation Safety Board asserted Chalk Ocean Airways failed to identify and properly repair fatigue cracks on the 1947 Grumman Turbo Mallard. The plane lost its right wing a few minutes after takeoff for the Bahamas at 500 feet and plunged into the ocean. The safety board, in its final report on the probable cause of the crash, noted numerous maintenance-related problems on the aircraft and another owned by the company, raising questions about Chalk's Ocean Airways aircraft maintenance practices. The signs of structural problems were there but not addressed. The safety board chairman, Mark Rossner, also said that the Federal Aviation Administration failed to detect and correct the airline's maintenance shortfalls. Regulators exempt older seaplanes from rigorous structural oversight. Chalks had no comment on the safety board's findings. The FAA said it had no indication that the airline's maintenance program was in question. The regulations are crystal clear that the carrier has primary responsibility for airworthiness of its fleet, and that includes the appropriate structural repairs, the agency said in a statement. Now, the interesting thing is they had an FAA inspector that came in and overviewed all this work, approved it just 2 months prior to this aircraft departing on its flight. By the aircraft itself held 17 passengers, and so by the FAA's own rules, it did not fall into an airline transport category, which unfortunately the oldest of the old airplanes airplanes was now removed from secondary inspections because it no longer fit the criteria that the FAA set forward, which is what the NTSB was extremely critical about. They also thought and alluded to that there was maybe too much of a informal relationship between the FAA and Chalk Airways. Riddled by this report, their aircraft aging fleet, they can't replace them. They're cannibalizing. Pilots are leaving. This was the final nail in the coffin for the longest continuing operating airline. In that same year, in 2007, Chalk's ceased to exist, and to this day, no longer is in existence as a airline operating out of Miami. So just a combination of many years of issues and really the business model changing, ultimately ending up into this horrific accident, which caused not only the aircraft and the crew to be lost, but ultimately the airline itself. I did want to talk a little bit about it because we joked a little bit in the beginning about how this episode came to be, but the television show Miami Vice, a symbol of both Miami in the 1980s, featured a Chalk seaplane in its opening credits. So if you could picture the Jan Hammer song, the and you see pink flamingos, I actually will be seeing those soon enough myself. We're traveling to Aruba here in February, so we'll get a chance to look at those. But no, you'll actually see this Chalk airplane taking off in the opening credits of Miami Vice. So there's that. And this is actually that particular aircraft. Its tail number was November 2969, and you'll see it in the opening credits of Miami Vice, the actual aircraft that crashed in this incident. It was featured in several episodes. It was also, and this came back to where yours truly was able to come up with the idea for this episode. You don't have to question my music listening, but it was George Michael's Careless Whisper. It was basically, featured in there that the lady was running away from a situation where somebody was cheating, and she got onto the Chalk's airline and flew off to the Bahamas. If you also are a fan of Spooky Season, if you liked our Spooky Season, this will fit right into it. It was the final scenes of The Silence of the Lambs, where Dr. Frederick Chilton is seen disembarking on a Chalk's aircraft in Bimini, where Hannibal Lecter is waiting to have him for dinner. A Chalk's plane also makes an appearance at the end of the After the Sunset Pierce Brosnan and Salma Hayek characters embracing as they stand next to it. Chalk's fleet was a high maintenance as it was glamorous. It was a unique carrier, its Watson Island base being the smallest port of entry into the United States. Chalk's revenues were about $7.5 million in 1986. That's when it carried 130,000 passengers. Most were staying at the resort's international properties, although island residents used the airline for shopping trips to Miami. And we talked about this as well earlier on, that resort actually bought the airline. So that makes a lot of sense why it would be their primary business, would be their patrons there. Well, my friends, the ticker is telling me that it is time for me to wrap up this episode. I hope you like it. I hope it fits the format that people are looking for. I'm really happy to be back in full health and on here talking with all of you. Remember to send me a line at dapodcast85@gmail.com. Drop me some of your own stories. Maybe tell me some stuff that out there that maybe you want to hear about. Also, remember we have the podcast stickers on the website for purchase for $5 a piece if you'd like to purchase one. And please remember to subscribe to the channel as it helps me get the word out there. I did want to mention on the end here, there's just been some tragic incidents lately. A person that I knew crashed outside of Indianapolis. Unfortunately, himself and his passenger both passed away. My hometown airport, not the one I worked at, but my hometown airport in Ludington, Michigan, TBM crashed on departure over the last weekend, and both individuals died in that plane crash, and their dog. Hard to speculate at this point, but the weather was definitely IFR. I know that airport doesn't have, I think, a lot of things like glycol, or if it does, it's very limited. But just remember when you're out flying, especially this time of year in the winter, do some extra checks, keep a close eye on things, and all else fails, you can always go tomorrow. So couple of those stories out there. I'll give people an update on some of the things I talked in the past podcast of some people that I know in the industry that fortunately had an accident in the Virgin Islands with the propane. We talked about that in the last episode. So a few things for us to follow up on, but thank you all for taking some time to sit down and listen to our stories today. And I am looking forward to our next episode. But until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway.